In this exercise, we complete a process that calls to the Atomsphere API to gather data regarding a deployed process. Then it uses that data to promote that process to a new environment by copying it from the existing deployment. At this point, I would encourage you to pause the video and to work with your activity guide, pages 1 through 9, to complete the activity. And afterwards, I would encourage you to come back to the video so we can review it together. Our first step is to jump into the platform, and you can see that the first couple of steps were just to get organized with an ARC3 folder here, and underneath there a 3-API folder as well. Next, we will browse the process library to find deploy by copy start, and you can limit your search results by typing in ARC3, then click install. Choose the folder that you created and click install. Then click view process. Now you will notice if you review the process, it starts with a no data start shape. And then the interesting point to observe here is that the set properties shape will have several dynamic process properties for process name, source deployment, and target environment ID. And all three of these values will become very important. The first branch gets some information for a deployment, and the second branch that we will build out will execute the copy and deploy to a new environment. So the first thing we need to do is to finish configuring this connection to the Atomsphere API. And you'll note it has a little configure button. On page 2 of your notes are some extensive instructions in case you have not created this yet. But if you've been going through the ARC classes, you actually already have this connection. It was built out in ARC 1, the alerts and events activity. And so you should be able to simply select that from wherever it is within your folder. I have in mine in the shared connections folder. Click OK. And let's try testing this. And you will see that this error is the same error that's displayed on step 5, page 3 of your activity guide. And that is because the deployment ID is incorrect, the one that was copied in. So for this query to run correctly, it must have a valid deployment ID. Our next step then will be to create a simple process and deploy it so that we can get a valid deployment ID. Let's close this, jump back out here. And right now we're going to create a simple test process. So we create that process and we're going to give it a no data start shape. And then simply drag a stop connector on there as well. So obviously this particular process does nothing, but this is just by way of example, and you could of course move any process that you deploy. So let's save this. Let's deploy this process now. So click on the deploy tab, and we are working with simple test. You see there are no attached environments. We're going to attach test and production both. So they are now attached. And now in the deployments tab, we're going to deploy manually to test. And click OK. All right, and now we have an actual deployment ID that is a valid ID, so we'll copy that. And then back in our build tab, we will update the source deployment ID. Click OK and OK. And let's save and run that process again in test mode. And you can see that it completed successfully. If we click on the stop shape now, and then shape source data and view the log. You can see that this is the deployment that we will be copying. So you see there's my note for manual deployment. This was the actual ID up here. This was the date and the person who deployed it. And so that's what we will be copying and deploying to a new environment. So let's jump back into the edit view. We're going to drag an Atomsphere API object onto the canvas. This will be an execute action. The connection is the one that we already used. And for the operation, we will create a new one. We'll rename this deploy process and import and select our connection and leave the filter blank. And we're selecting deploy process and click next. And this window shows the request profile and response profile names, so we can click finish and then save and close. And click OK. And I'm just going to drag a stop shape onto here as well. So I'm looking now at page 7 and step 15. We created this connection, and now we need to supply all the correct information to be able to load the correct deployment and target the correct environment. So we want to set these parameters, and they are using dynamic process properties. So we're going to have to enter the name for those dynamic process properties ourselves. So we'll start with deployment ID, click OK, and this property name is source deployment, and click OK. Next will be the environment ID. Target environment ID and click OK. And oops. And the last one is the digest. Click OK. Deploy digest and click OK and OK. Now deploy digest, because that was not set in the set properties, that was set after the get action was performed. So the deploy digest is set here. Click OK. So those three are set. Let's save this and test it. And you should get the same error that is listed on page 8 at the top of page 8 in step 16, that there is an incorrect environment ID. So let's close that. So we need to get the correct environment ID, so that'll be our last step here. So go to the Manage and add a management view. And our target will be the production environment. So grab the environment ID from production. Then for set properties, update the value for target environment ID and click OK and OK. Save and test. And you can see that the entire process ran successfully if you click on the stop shape and then shape source data and click on the view source to view the document. And you can see here that there is a successful notification. We can also see this by clicking on the Deploy tab and finding the simple test deployment. And when you click on production, you can see that there is a deployment. And if you click on the notes, you can see that there is a note that this was a deployment of version 1, and this was through the API. And that's the end of the exercise, how to use the API to both query for data and to be able to copy and to deploy to a new environment.